Hello students, this is Benazir Fatima, Assistant Professor, School of Legal Studies, Babu Banarsidass University. Today I will be covering up the topic concept of utility under the subject economics. This is the index. We will be having the definition of utility, law of diminishing marginal utility, assumptions of law of diminishing marginal utility, and the example of the law by the table and the graph of the table. Now we move on to the concept of utility. First of all, we'll define what is utility. It says here that to understand the law of diminishing marginal utility, we need to know what is utility first. So utility is basically the capacity or the property of a commodity to give satisfaction. It is termed as the want satisfying power of a commodity. The normal definition to understand utility is that it is basically a feeling of satisfaction which a person gets after consumption of certain commodity. Now, further bifurcation of utility has two categories, that is total utility and marginal utility. Now the first one is total utility. Total utility basically refers to the total satisfaction obtained from the consumption of all possible units of a commodity. Basically, it is the entire feeling, the total feeling of satisfaction that you get after consuming each and every unit of the commodity. Now the marginal utility is the additional utility which is derived from the consumption of one more unit of given commodity. Marginal utility can be analyzed as the additional utility, the amount of utility that you experience while consuming every additional unit of a commodity. With every bite you feel more satisfied, and the satisfaction which is derived after consumption of the additional unit is termed as the marginal utility. Marginal utility can be calculated numerically as mu equals to tu, that is total utility of nth value, minus total utility of the next value, that is n minus 1. We'll further see how it's used in a form of a table and a graph. It will make it a bit more easier to understand. So just a quick revision of what is utility. It is basically the want satisfying power of a commodity. It is a feeling which gives you a feeling of satisfaction, which gives you a relaxation after consumption of certain commodities. This relaxation could be mental, it could be emotional, it could be physical. And utility is further divided into two categories, that is total utility and marginal utility. The total satisfaction obtained from the consumption of a commodity, of the entire commodity basically, is the total utility, and the satisfaction which you gain after having additional amount of commodity is the marginal utility. Now the next one, which is the main portion of this particular topic, is the law of diminishing marginal utility. Now this concept of marginal utility is basically, it was basically converted into a law which states that utility derived from every additional unit of consumption goes on diminishing as it continues up to a certain level where total utility is constant. The marginal utility becomes zero when then it becomes negative if further forced to consume additional units of a commodity, and this phenomena is known as diminishing marginal utility. So we all have felt, we all feel it rather in our daily lives, that when we are very hungry, so supposedly we need to consume any commodity desperately, we are very hungry, we are in desperate need of something for consuming. So initially we are more satisfied after consuming it, and as we go on consuming the commodity more and more, the commodity will become, it will give us more amount of satisfaction, and slowly and gradually that satisfaction will go on decreasing and then diminishing, and then it will become negative, and then it will be known as the diminishing marginal utility, because this phenomenon would be known as diminishing marginal utility because we can see that the feeling of liking or wanting something in the initial stage has now become the feeling of disliking something. Like when we are very hungry, we consume an apple, we eat an apple very at a very speedy level, because we are very hungry. We want to eat as much as we can initially, and then as our stomach starts filling up, we tend to reduce our speed of eating, and then at the last unit, or if we are forced to consume at the last unit, basically the utility becomes zero. And if we are further forced to consume one more apple, then definitely it will lead to a negative impact, because we won't like to consume further, and at that situation the marginal utility will become negative. So we can see the nature of the marginal utility. Initially, it is at an increasing level. It is increased. It is at its maximum. Then further, with the growth of consumption, as we consume more and more of commodity, the satisfaction, the marginal utility, it will goes on decreasing, that is diminishing, and then further if we are forced to consume any additional units of commodity, then it will become negative. And this entire nature, this entire journey of marginal utility from being moving into a negative direction, it was basically a declining direction, diminishing direction. This is known as the diminishing marginal utility. So here we have the definition. It says, as we go on consuming more than one unit of consumption, the utility derived from each successive unit of consumption goes on diminishing. So this law is known as law of diminishing marginal utility. I hope this concept is clear. Just a quick revision of this concept. Marginal utility means utility derived from every additional unit of consumption goes on diminishing. It continues up to a certain level, and where total utility is constant, the marginal utility becomes zero. Then it becomes negative, and further if it is forced to consume additional unit of a commodity, this phenomena is known as diminishing marginal utility. This means that whenever we are consuming a commodity, the marginal utility is at its maximum initially, and as we go on consuming more and more amount of unit of a commodity, the marginal utility, the satisfaction, the feeling of satisfaction goes on diminishing, and at the last unit maybe it may becomes zero, and then if you're forced to consume further, then it will become negative, and this phenomena is turned as diminishing marginal utility. And this particular phenomena was it was given in the form of a law which is universal for each and every individual, and that is why it is known as the law of diminishing marginal utility. Now here we have an example. That example says, assume that a consumer consumes 6 apples one after another. The first apple gives him 20 utils. A util is basically the imaginary unit for measuring the utility. Now when he consumes the second and the third apple, the marginal utility of each additional unit would be lesser. This is because with an increase in consumption of apple, his desire to consume more apple falls, right? Because your stomach starts getting filled, so you are no longer in a desire to eat more amount of units of apple. As you consume more and more amount of apple, your craving to eat apple becomes diminishing. Therefore, this example proves that the point that every successive unit of a commodity used gives the utility with a diminishing rate. Now we can explain this more further with the help of a schedule and a diagram. Now this is the table which explains the previous example. Now at 1 unit of consumption, you have the maximum total and the maximum marginal utility. Now with the second unit of consumption, you can see that the marginal utility is decreasing. It came at 15 and the total become 35. Now at the third unit of consumption, you can see marginal is still decreasing and the total becomes 45 because we are adding, it is a total amount of satisfaction. So we are adding up all the utility which is achieved at each level. At the fourth unit of consumption, we can see that the marginal utility is 0.5, that is 5, and the total becomes 50. Now at the fifth, it is 0 because you are totally filled and you cannot have another bite, and there it remains constant. Your total utility becomes constant. If you are forced to consume the last bite because maybe you don't want to throw it away or get it wasted or something like that, or somebody forces you to consume the last bite, then you consume it anyhow with the pressure, but anyhow your marginal utility becomes negative, and there your total starts diminishing. Now in the above table, the total utility obtained from the first apple is 20 utils, you can see, and it goes on increasing until we reach a satisfaction at the fifth level. On the other hand, marginal utility keeps on diminishing with every additional apple consumed, and when we consume the sixth apple, we have gone over the limit, and the marginal utility is negative and the total utility falls. The next is the graph of the table, which represents the nature of the law of diminishing marginal utility. You can see that it is a diminishing curve, it is a declining curve, it is a curve which is going down from left to right, stating that as we consume more and more amount of unit of a commodity, the satisfaction level goes on diminishing. Now this graph is based on the table drawn earlier showing a marginal utility curve. In this diagram, units of apple consumed are showing on x-axis, and MU, that is marginal utility, is being shown on the y-axis. Now you can see that MU falls from 20 to 5 on consumption of first unit to fourth unit. When the fifth unit is consumed, MU becomes 0, which is a point of satiety. That means you are totally saturated, you are totally satisfied, totally filled. You cannot have a further, you don't feel like having a further unit. But still, when you're forced at the sixth unit, the marginal utility becomes negative. So this was all about the concept of utility, basically focusing on law of diminishing marginal utility with the help of a table and a graph.